Okay, Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is September 9th, 2022. Please click on the subscribe button here in the lower right to subscribe, and also the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when new episodes of Civil War Chat are released. Today's topic is January 6th and the 1877 KKK hearings. There's some parallels between what we've seen with the January 6 hearings and also the Ku Klux Klan hearings of 1871. We'll get into that. First, I need to describe a little bit about the 1868 election. Lincoln was reelected during the Civil War in 1864. And then he was inaugurated president for the second term in 1865, but was shortly thereafter assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson was not a traditional Republican. In fact, before the war, he was a Democrat. And so therefore the Republicans were not happy with him. And they wanted him out of office. They actually tried to impeach him in 1868, which would be the last year of his term. They failed in that, but their next objective was, if with it not being able to impeach him, then to be sure that whoever got elected president in 1868 was a Republican. And that would turn out to be Ulysses Grant, and he won that election. Now, what happened is Johnson lost his power in the autumn elections of 1866. By 1867, the radical Republicans in Congress were overriding his vetoes and setting up laws that would enable them to establish puppet regimes in the South, carpetbag puppet regimes in the South that would reliably vote Republican. They would do this by creating a new electorate in the South, and that new electorate would be adult Black males. The purpose of doing that, of course, was to see to it that those states remained Republican. Of course, that's not what the Republicans said. The Republicans said this is our effort to try to provide, individual freedom of choice government for the slaves that have been freed. The true objective, or well, certainly the foremost objective of the Republicans, was to be sure that they had a control of the Congress through the representatives of those southern states until such time as the future states of the Western territories could be carved out as states and admitted to the Union. Because any states carved out of those Western territories, like Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, what have you, they would be naturally Republican. And then the Republican Party, of course, knew that, so that they really felt like they realized that they only had to hold on to the voting control in the South until those naturally organic states, organically Republican states of the Western territories came into the picture. But it was to have control in the southern states, they had to create the carpetbag regimes. The carpetbag regimes, let's look at the 1868 election. The 14th Amendment enabled all but 3 of the 11 former Confederate states to vote in the 1868 election. And that was because those 8, 11 minus 3 leaves 8, those 8 were either carpetbag regimes or scallywag regimes. Of those 8, all but Louisiana and Georgia voted for President Grant. Now, what happened in Louisiana is significant. It, to a lesser extent, happened in Georgia. The 14th Amendment required, well, actually, it was the 1867 Reconstruction Acts that required the southern states to register adult male blacks for voting, and some whites had to be excluded. And then those states also had to set up state constitutions that would be approved by Congress before they could be readmitted. All this was contingent upon the carpetbag regimes being admitted to the Union through the 14th Amendment. But what was really going on was that the way that the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 operated, the Southern states could not avoid complying with the conditions of the 14th Amendment, and that resulted in these carpetbag regimes that passed and ratified the 14th Amendment. The Southern states without the carpetbag regimes had already rejected the 14th Amendment. But anyway, here we are in the summer of 1868. The 14th Amendment is ratified because some of the carpetbag regimes in the South ratified it. It took 3/4 of the states to do that, you see. That's why they needed some of these Southern states to come in and do that. And so they did ratify it, and that enabled those states to vote for the president in the autumn of 1868. Now, the interesting thing is that Louisiana and Georgia voted against Grant, even though they were carpetbag regimes or Republican-controlled regimes. And the reason for that, particularly in the case of Louisiana, was that there was violence. You see, Louisiana was about, the true population distribution in Louisiana was about 50% white and 50% black. But the way that the voter registration was handled under the Republican rules promulgated by Congress resulted in a black majority of about 2-to-1 over whites in Louisiana. So here it is, just 4 years, less than 4 years after the Civil War had ended, and the state of Louisiana was going to see its government change from white male native Southerners to something controlled by black voters who had no experience in self-government, and many of whom, in fact, certainly over 90%, were illegitimate, or not illegitimate, but illiterate. So those native white Southerners were looking at a radical change in their government within 3 years after the end of the war. And certainly it was something that they did not believe anybody in the North, any state in the North, would tolerate, seeing their state turned over to ex-slaves, or more significantly to immigrants of any kind. The best example of this is California. I bring this up because many people will criticize the Southerners for being, racist against the new black voters. But what you find is that the racism was just as prevalent in the North as it was in the South. And the only problem was, the only thing that complicates the comparison is that there just weren't that many blacks in the North. But if you look out west to California, it turns out at one point, the 10% of the population of the state of California was Chinese. And this resulted in all kinds of federal Chinese exclusion acts and discrimination against Chinese that California basically imposed upon the federal government to pass in order to keep the Chinese from becoming a significant voting bloc in California. In California itself, for example, not only did they oppose the Chinese from voting, but they actually, they lynched them. I think between 1850 and 1902, about 2/3 of all the lynching victims in the state of California were Chinese. Now, consider the fact that the Chinese never amounted to more than 10% of the population in California, whereas in South Carolina and in Mississippi, blacks were more than 50% of the population. You can see that if the Californians were going to get really aggravated with just a 10% threshold of some unwanted minority in their state, lynch them. They would imagine what they would do if the majority of the voters in California were Chinese Americans. the Californians took such action that the Asian Americans could not become naturalized citizens of the United States until 1943, when some of them were fighting in the World War II in defense of America. So now let's get back to let me get back to the topic of the Reconstruction era and comparing it to January 6th. When it became evident that Louisiana, particularly, and to a lesser extent Georgia, had used violence through organizations like the KKK to get those states to vote for Horatio Seymour, who was Ulysses Grant's opponent in the 1868 elections. Then the Republican Congress got pretty excited. When in 1872, the off-year elections of 1872 resulted in more intervention by KKK type of organizations, then the Republican Congress took more severe action. Excuse me, not 1872, that would be 1870 would be the off-year election. And beginning in 1871, they started the KKK hearings. So much like the January 6th hearings here during last summer, in January 1871, after the 1870 elections, Congress started hearings concerning the Ku Klux Klan. The first committee hearings were held in the Senate, and I think that started on January 19th, 1871, just 1 month after the end of 1870. They had a total of, I think, 7 members. 5 of them were Republicans and 2 of them were Democrats. So everything was basically controlled in that committee by the Republicans. They did interrogate 50 people, and they came up with, of course, some horror stories that they wanted to emphasize. But again, they did not have to accommodate any of the people that the minority of Democrats wanted to also have testify. And also in these hearings, anybody could be accused of anything and never be given an opportunity to defend themselves, because this was not actually a court trial. This was a hearing, and in a hearing they can bring in anybody they want and exclude anybody they want. When who's ever in charge of that committee determines that. So that's what happened with the Senate. But then a number of congressional Republicans wanted more. They wanted more. They wanted something like the January 6th situation. And so there was a joint committee set up in Congress to investigate the Ku Klux Klan. Their show, like the January 6th show, went on here in 2022 all summer, run by the Democrats, composed of nothing but accusations against Donald Trump and his followers. No chance for any of those who are accused to defend themselves, none. That went on all summer, and the media went along with it, completely went along with it. The media was just another branch of the Republican Party with influence in the public because of their ability to distribute the news to the public. Well, the situation in 1871 was much the same, because the joint congressional committee on these hearings also was composed of, I think there was more than 7 people, but they definitely had a majority of Republicans in control of it. But their investigations went on for 10 months, 10 months of investigations. And over that period, they compiled 13,000 pages of testimony and reports. 13,000. And of course, that every day, you had more stuff coming out of these hearings and more reports coming out, under the control of the Republican Party for 10 months. So in that sense, I think it was very similar to January 6th. You had accusations made about extra legal white supremacist forces in the South. You had no chance for them to defend themselves. And just like in January 6th, the same sort of thing went on. So I think those comparisons are significant. There's no denying that there was Ku Klux Klan violence in the Reconstruction era prior to the Ku Klux Klan acts that were passed in 1871. But there's also no, in my judgment, no denying that the evidence that was put before the public through the congressional hearings was biased because it was controlled ultimately by the Republicans. Now, here, as an example, what happened in 1872 when Grant ran for re-election, there was also state elections in Louisiana. In those state elections, Congress eventually concluded, and this was a Republican-controlled Congress, the 1872 elections in the state of Louisiana, according to an investigation done by the Congress, were corrupt on both sides. The results were unreliable. The Congress recommended that the president direct the state to have new elections. Well, Grant did not go along with that. He basically said at the end of 1872 that into 1873, I think that early 1873 actually made the decision that the previous Republican regime was going to be held in place. I think, as I had mentioned in one of my earlier videos with you, what happened after the 1870 election, no, 1868 election, and then also again against the 1870 election, is that states like Louisiana that had lost the vote, for Grant in 1868, even though there were twice as many blacks in the electorate as whites, in the voter registration rolls as recorded by the carpetbag regime. When they saw that they lost those elections, they adopted some new procedures to ensure that they wouldn't lose future elections. And in the case of Louisiana, and other states followed this, Louisiana set up what they called a voter returning board. Therefore, whenever there was an election, the votes would be tallied, but they would never be certified until the voter returning board certified them. And the voter returning board could throw out ballots, bring in new ballots, whatever it wanted to do. And they did a lot of that in 1872. And that's why Congress decided that the elections were fraudulent on both sides. They were fraudulent in the sense that the Louisiana whites suppressed the black vote, and they were fraudulent in the sense that the Republican carpetbag regime in Louisiana basically used the returning board to get the election results that they wanted. Now, of course, the important point in all of this is that if you set up something like a voter returning board that ensures that only one party is going to win an election, the party that is not going to win the election is forced into taking action that is extra legal, or they have a choice. Either they can take some action that will get them some power, or they can just let the party in power continue to rule, and that results in a one-party state, in which case that would be the Republican Party. So it should have been evident to the Republicans that if they use the voter returning boards to determine the election outcomes, that there is going to be some resistance. They're going to fight back. Now, the last carpetbag governor of South Carolina realized this. His last name was Chamberlain. I can't remember his first name at this time, but that's exactly what he said. He said, the Ku Klux Klan was bad. And the similar organizations to it was bad. But if we're not going to let legitimate elections take place in these states, if we're going to promote corrupted governments, if we're going to install corrupted governments, where bills get through the legislature with bribery, and that incompetents are running some of the major agencies of the government, you can expect violence. You should expect violence. But, you know, his voice, at least in terms of that opinion, was did not carry sway with the Republicans in Washington, D.C. Now, ultimately, what happened is that the states that were carved out of the Western territories were Republican, and as they gradually came into the country, the Republicans kept control of the Senate for the most part, through the addition of these new states in the Western territories. The result for the Southerners was that as the new states came into the country organically Republican, the Republican Party was willing to back off of controlling the South, particularly because after Grant used his power, dictatorial power, to make the carpetbag governor in Louisiana governor another time, a second time, by even though Congress had recommended that the elections be rerun, that was seen as dictatorial, not just in the South, but also in the North. Increasingly, Grant was criticized for that. And the result was that Reconstruction, as we formerly know it, ended in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as president. Interestingly, again, the election returning board in Louisiana played a key part. It really didn't matter what the election results were in Louisiana, so long as that returning board would vote for Rutherford Hayes. I think one of the investigators for the Democrats that was down in Louisiana while all this was being worked out after the 1876 election said that that the board was offered to vote Democrat for a sizable bribe. I can't remember if it was $100,000 or $1 million, but it was something like that. Anyway, that's part of the story. So I wanted to also share with you here my book, which is Ulysses Grant's Failed Presidency. A lot of this story is in this book. You can get it at Amazon for $22. If you want an autographed copy, you can get it from me by emailing me, Phil, PHIL_Lee, LEIGH, at me.com. Okay, well, that's our show for today, and I want to thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.